Mike Taylor, CEO of Contego. I'm joined today with Chris Smith, one of our senior project managers, as we're in conversation with Natural England, answering all the questions we're all asking with regards to Gull licensing in 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm David Brown. I'm a senior advisor in a new team actually called the Complex Casework team, and effectively that team deals with various areas of licensing that are complex, funnily enough, but not necessarily complex in their content, but in a more sort of generalistic way in terms of changes in legislation, recent changes in legislation, in interest at various different levels, including ministerial levels. So that's a new team really that's been born out of the changes in general license, which quite a few people will be familiar with.
What challenges are the gull population facing in the UK?
I think that the major challenge for the gull population, the large gull population, for lesser blackback and herring gull specifically, is quite a major reduction in their what you would term as their natural breeding population, their breeding sites. So specifically coastal areas, but more specifically than that, rural areas. So beyond those sort of traditional coastal sites, and we've seen a real decline, particularly in rural areas, of gull numbers. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons for that. They tend to be linked to food availability first and foremost. It's possible that things like landfill sites, it has an impact on that. I'm sure it probably does. And then also just good nesting habitat. And clearly, when you start to look to urban areas, they offer actually a better deal for large gulls in terms of nesting habitat, in terms of reduced predation pressure, in terms of food availability and temperature. Actually, it tends to be a bit warmer, which is always useful. So the challenge effectively is a movement of the general population, but a reduction overall, quite a significant reduction in numbers since the 60s and early 70s. It's quite a significant reduction.
What were the drivers for the license changes in 2020?
Yeah, I think what's been very interesting, looking at the license applications that were received last year, we received since the change in general licensing, we received an additional 1,600 to 1,700, and a large proportion of those, around about 75%, related specifically to large gulls, and specifically public health and safety as the purpose, and specifically in urban areas. So what was really interesting was that gave us a really good understanding of what had been controlled previously under general license, if that makes sense, because all of a sudden, people needed to apply. In the past, under general license, we don't monitor that. So we don't actually have any idea really what goes on under general license. And that the reason I say that is because that really validates the change in effectively the conservation status of those species. So we've seen a gradual decline in herring gull and lesser blackback gull numbers over the last few years. And those numbers got to a point where effectively we needed to put in, or DEFRA rather needed to put in a block on that, essentially, to say, right, hang on, we need to remove these birds from the general license, and we need to effectively have more of an idea of or control rather over how many of those birds were being killed. And the basic reason for that was the conservation status of the species. And what was interesting, of course, last year we could see that need, what people needed to do and the numbers that they were controlling, which then of course, as I say, validated that decision effectively. What's interesting about that is that there has been the data in the past very much centers around the monitoring of seabirds populations in a natural nesting environment. So therefore, you know, in rural areas, particularly coastal areas. But recently, despite the pandemic, JNCC managed to complete effectively a more wider reaching survey, if you like. So it included a lot of urban areas, which is really key information, because I think most people would say, you know, reasonable people would say, you know, that the numbers of gulls in urban areas seem to be increasing. You know, that seems to be a trend. You seem to see more of them. There are obviously all sorts of variables for that, but certainly the early results of that survey show that those populations are increasing in urban areas. Now, it's important to say at this point that we're not talking about a population number going back to perhaps the 60s and 70s, you know, at that peak, but there's a certain trend which is important to note. More details of that should come out in February. We'd hope to see them a bit earlier, but they should come out in more detail in February. So that effectively sets the scene for us. You know, essentially, we then needed to provide a mechanism to deal with licenses for those species of birds beyond the general license, so effectively individual licensing.
What were the main challenges last year that you faced with regards to licence applications?
I would say the greatest challenge last year was the quantity of applications that we received in a very short space of time. I think one of the biggest challenges was then following on from that was communication on our part. It was something that we didn't do very well, actually. There were reasons why the process was set up the way it was. With hindsight, it didn't work as we would have liked it to have done. I think that was the biggest challenge. And then I think the second challenge was the information that we received in the applications. It was clear to me, looking at them, you know, picking several out and looking at them and getting a feel for the license applications, that people were struggling to really understand what we needed in order to assess it. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, because most people, it would be the first time of applying for a license. You know, they just used a general license before, they'd never done it before. So I think that, you know, from our point of view, with hindsight, our guidance could have been better, you know, in terms of helping people understand what they needed to supply in their application. Now, it's interesting because, you know, we're specifically here talking about two main purposes. One in law, one is conservation of wild birds or fauna and flora. The other one is public health and safety. And actually, of the two, public health and safety is easier to quantify. I say easy, but it's not easy, but it's easier than conservation. Similar to things like damage, the purpose of damage, very easy to quantify damage to crops or damage to something. Public health and safety tended to fall into two main categories, which was either nesting material or aggressive birds. By and large, it was one or the other or both. And it was getting, effectively, I think that was the biggest challenge, was getting the right degree of information to show what the problem really was. And that can be subjective in public health and safety, and that was something that I saw a lot of, that, you know, it's kind of open to interpretation, isn't it? What constitutes a risk to health and safety? And I think once you've got that nailed down, I think that was probably the biggest area of concern for me. It was very, very difficult at times to really see that clearly. So I would say that was probably the two things, was the evidence and the communication.
What were the main reasons for licenses being rejected last year?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I think, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was a very high percentage of applications were rejected. Very few licenses actually issued. We issued some for public health and safety. We issued some for conservation. We issued some for damage. But overall, the trend was rejection across the board, actually. And that tells you something straight away, you know, that there's a clear link there. And I think what I would say is the main reason that we rejected most of those applications was a lack of evidence. So we weren't given enough information to be able to say with confidence we can issue a license to control that species, you know, at that level. What I would say at this point is that historically with licensing, when we receive a license of any description, really, license application, generally the first thing you do is you have a look at the form, you know, you get the sort of crux of it in your mind, and then you contact the applicant and you say, yeah, you know, I just need a bit more information. Now that step is actually critical, but it was a step that was removed last year, and the reason it was removed was because we thought at the time that it would just take too much time. And in actual fact, it didn't work out that way, of course. Probably had the opposite effect. But you know, what I think is different this year is that once you go through the screening phase and we can see that there's a genuine licensing need, we then allocate an advisor who will talk to you and say, look, this is the kind of information that we need. This is the sort of stuff we need in order to make an assessment. And of course, the other issue, of course, was that people just put in a figure of numbers of eggs or numbers of birds, and again, that's something that we don't normally take that as gospel. You know, we in other areas of licensing will contact you and say, well, and this links to one of the licensing tests I was talking about with proportionality. You know, so it's often the case that applicants need a bit of help with that, and we say, well, all right, let's err on the side of caution and reduce a small number, and let's see if it has an impact. Let's see if it actually works, and then we can review that from that point on. Licenses aren't, once they're issued, they're not set in stone. We can amend them if needed, if there's a licensing need, a genuine licensing need.
What evidence are Natural England looking for on applications?
So I think I'll concentrate on public health and safety purpose. I think that's fair enough, isn't it, for this? Really, for me, and I've done a lot of licensing for public health and safety in the past. For me, is the first bit of evidence which is key is what is the risk, and really that I can't emphasize that more. You know, and it could be that, I don't know, for example, you know, the risk is dive bombing gulls, for example, you know, outside of a unit or a factory or something like that. Now, what is helpful in situations like that is, of course, any information relating to near misses, if you like, in terms of an accident, but information from the site owner themselves can be extremely useful, because and I know a lot of the time, you know, that in terms of pest control, you know, those people are contracted, aren't they, by a company or a site, but it would be really useful to have the specific risk mapped out by the landowner or the owner of the property. And that could be something like, well, look, I've got a responsibility to my employees and those using the building under Health and Safety at Work Act, and this activity by this gull is contravening that, is causing me problems that way. So the first bit of key information is what is the specific risk, and backing that up with information, very useful information from the landowner themselves or the site operator. That really, I can't emphasize that more. That's really important, because if you think about it, we aren't the experts in public health and safety, you know, so we're looking for somebody else really to really clearly map out what the specific risks are, and we can look at that and think, yeah, okay, you know, you've explained that, you know, you've got a responsibility to your employees, those using the site, and there's a risk. So that's the first key bit of information. The second bit is, have you tried everything else? Essentially, you know, have you we look at lethal control, even the removal of eggs and nests, as a very much as a last resort. You know, we'd rather not do it, but if you can't do anything else and you need to remove that risk, then we can license that, you know. And again, is that proportionate? Is it one nest, you know, which and it relates to one aggressive gull, rather than it being all gulls on the roof? Is it a couple of particular gulls? I know that's not so straightforward to say that, but it can be like that in some cases. It can be a specific bird, you know. So if it is, fine, let us know that, and we can, you know, we can license the removal of that. That's much more proportionate rather than saying let's just get rid of the whole lot. I mean, that's an overall management issue of the site, isn't it, to prevent those birds nesting on that roof. So it's really evidence of that. In addition to that, I would say evidence around the site itself, and maybe just beyond that, what's going on around that site. The site itself, is this a one-off, or does this happen every year? Is this a problem every year? And if it is, what happens, and at what points of the year? You know, so it's effectively telling the story of why you've come to the decision where you need to carry out control. And effectively, I think for pest control, I'm assuming they will be contacted by a landowner who says, we've got this problem, can you come and sort it out? But actually the problem is theirs, isn't it? So they need to be more involved in helping you guys with you know, what is actually needed, and providing that evidence and explaining effectively why they need to do that.
So following on from that, David, will licences be granted if non-lethal methods of control haven't been implemented or trialled before the licence application?
No, as the easy answer to that. You know, it's part of the licensing tests. You must demonstrate that you've tried everything else. You must do that. It's a clear licensing test. You know, so it could be, it's worth saying at that point, it could be that it's not appropriate. You know, for example, netting a huge roof of an enormous building, it's not appropriate. That actually in itself isn't proportional, or proportionate rather. So, but you need to either demonstrate that you've tried something else, or that you couldn't try something else. But that is a key part of the licensing tests, and actually was one of the reasons that we were challenged by Wild Justice when it came to the general license, because it didn't clearly show that, and that's important from a legal point of view.
In certain instances, David, there may be a need for an emergency license. Is there a process in place for this?
That's a good question. I don't think there'll be a specific process as such, but I think, in all honesty, if you've got, and I can think of one or two in particular, if you've got a particular issue, we have a process in place where we can effectively escalate something very quickly. Whereas last year that was a bit more difficult to do that. So it's something that we've recognised from last year, where, for example, we needed, to have earlier input with things like, nuclear power stations, for example, or hospitals, or, we need to be a bit more actively involved. So I wouldn't say that we've got an emergency, let's get a license out quickly, because it doesn't really work that way. But what we will have is a means of responding very quickly. When we can see that there's a particular issue. So say, for example, it's an emergency, somebody just goes through the screening phase, which is very quick, I hasten to add. We can see that immediately and bypass potentially, so that the key is, that's where the screening phase is very useful. Even for an emergency situation, we can see it immediately and look at the core details, and then pick up the phone and contact you and say, right, look, what's the, so the screening phase captures that really key information, which is so important. It means that we can put something else to one side and go straight to that, because we can see it quickly, rather than having to open up an application form and other documents and looking through them. And, it's something that we can see really quickly. So I would say that the screening phase will capture those more emergency needs.
What will be the deadline for applications that do need a license?
There won't be a specific deadline. I think there was a deadline last year, wasn't there, from memory, of the end of March, I think. But effectively, you can put in a license application, or go through the screening phase, I should say, whenever you like. That's entirely up to you. Some areas of licensing, the need is earlier in the year, but actually we received applications last year right up until September, in some cases. So there isn't a specific deadline. We're dealing with it differently. I know that we had a March deadline last year, and that the reason for that was so that we could get a good handle on what actually was going to come in. Whereas this year, of course, we know we've got a fairly good idea based on last year. So there isn't a strict deadline on that.
So the question everybody's asking, David, is what does good look like with regards to an application?
That's something that I hear a lot. What does a good application look like? And what I was talking about, the risk. What actually is the risk? Pretend that we haven't got a clue. What is the risk to public health and safety? Really clearly map that out, and what's actually going on. What actually is going on. Is it in terms of nesting material? The more information, the better. To support the application, and clearly what else have you tried?
We do a lot of falconry work, David, so at what point would that become licensable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we're well aware that the use of falconry can be very, very effective in terms of non-lethal methods of control. I say non-lethal in inverted commas, but clearly if there is a risk of the falcon or whatever bird you're using is going to get a hold of one of those gulls and kill it, then that becomes licensable. Disturbance, less so. You're really talking about actually the impact on a bird itself. There's also, of course, an argument in when the birds are nesting, that if those birds are disturbed, they could be leaving a nest and leaving eggs, or leaving chicks that obviously need to be fed from parent birds. So again, we just need it's being sensible, really reasonable with that, and having the right information in order to license it.
So David, a question that we get asked quite a lot is, when does a nest become a nest?
It's a good point, that, isn't it? Because it's quite difficult with gulls, because let's face it, quite often the nesting material is virtually nothing in it. It could literally be corrugated roof, and the eggs are dropped in. But legally, the nest is protected when it's either it's under construction or being used effectively. It's as clear as that. So if the adult birds are building the nest, it's protected. It's only until those birds have hatched and fledged that the nest effectively loses its legal protection, just becomes a heap of rubbish from the sounds of it. So it's the building and the use. So if the birds are building it and somebody's washing that roof, that they're committing an offence.
What repercussions will be in place for people who don't follow the law?
Yeah, so a license, whether it's a general license or an individual license or whatever kind of license it is effectively your defence in law, because what you're proposing to do in the eyes of the law is illegal. So your defence gives you your license gives you that defence. Now, if you breach the license, so you don't follow the conditions of the license, we are the enforcement body. We can take action. If you act without a license, of course, you're committing an offence in the same ways that you commit any other offence, actually. So that's a referral to the police. Usually a wildlife crime officer. I mean, essentially the threats tend to be. I'd have to go back and have a look at it, but the usual is sort of 6-month imprisonment, and then fines in the thousands of pounds. Now, in the past, it generally hasn't come to that. There can be quite a bit of restorative justice that's used, but I did see recently, related to another species, which was bats, I believe, in the London area, where a developer was fined a record number. I think it was something like £500,000. It was a huge amount of money. It was the largest fine ever for a wildlife offence. So that, of course, that in itself, I know it's different, it's a different species, but provides an element of case law, and it's also sort of it's kind of indicative, isn't it, of how wildlife crime is taken perhaps a bit more seriously than it was in the past. So, I don't think what I'm trying to say is I don't think you could just dismiss it as, I'll get away with it. It's more likely now than ever before to be investigated, and you certainly do risk there's a real risk of prosecution, whether that be a strong or heavy, large fine, or possibly a suspended sentence.
Absolutely brilliant, David. Thanks for your time today. On behalf of myself and Chris, we've really enjoyed it. A lot of really, really useful information that I think is going to be really key to getting the message across and making sure that Gull licensing applications this year is a lot smoother process. Thank you very much.